All right. Aloha mai kako. Hope all is going well out there, world. This is the first of a few supplemental videos that will follow up with a podcast on the Quantum Wizardry podcast. So I wanted to show off a little bit because there are some things that are happening, or rather show and share with you some of the things that I discussed that were happening on the actual investigation. Now, episode 3, we go a little bit further into this whole concept of grid building. We talk about the geopathic energies and how we can actually utilize this within the context of a city. Now, I alluded to a lot without saying specifically what I felt was actually happening. The grid itself, when we have these in place, uses the natural ley energies of a space, and in doing so is actually able to access one way or the other. And I often think of it as like a circuit board, right? If we look at a circuit board, there's a power source, there can be transmitters, there can be things that really help all of those to work together. Now, if we look at this more from a bioelectric, geoelectric concept, then the energy can actually be utilized of both the earth itself as well as anything that sits upon it. My feel of what was happening was that the fires that had occurred in San Francisco in both 1851 as well as in 1906 were utilized for a very specific purpose. It was generally in a very similar area, and utilizing fire is something that can purify an area, right? The heat of it can clear the slate of a space. If you look at like a forest fire, for example, right? We have all these old growth trees, lightning strikes, and that whole area can go up in flames. Now, what happens is highly destructive and can then ultimately turn into, in the changing of the seasons, a new area of renewed growth. Now, my feel of it is that something similar had happened. There was an energy that existed in this specific area that someone wanted to clear. Now, in clearing it then meant that it needed to be subject to a purifying agency, and in this case, that was fire. I wanted to share a little bit with everyone in terms of some of the things that I ended up seeing. So let me go ahead and share the screen here, because this then got to be more interesting in terms of the grid itself, which I'll get to in a bit. More so looking at generally the fire and the area of the fires. Let's go back even one more here, which is the fire on May 3rd, generally around 11 p.m., 1851. And then a much larger surface area here that is indicated in the red on in 1906. Now, to put things into context, the Hotel Majestic was built in 1902, the Schmidt family home, which was then transitioned into an actual hotel in 1904. 1906 came, and then we looked at that in terms of the transition of this purifying agency and of this fire. And as we look at that then here, well, getting a little ahead of myself here in terms of the general area. Let's see if you can build that up just a bit, go a little further. No, I think that is about all we're going to get. Let's see here. So generally speaking, as we look at this surface area, which is a good amount in terms of the fire itself, this area along the pier as it came in and down into the area that went pretty pervasive, coming all the way up in this general space here, was something that the areas outside of the fire itself then was not subject to that same purifying aspect, the clearing power of fire. Now, it became pretty interesting is on the dowsing, when I had actually gone to explore a little bit more. Hotel Majestic is located down here, which is, it's difficult to point out on this map, but it is just outside of the range of the fire itself. And what I ended up encountering were these two strong lines, which crosses on California here and Van Ness across, and that led inevitably to these two other points. So point one that I had first explored was further I can get up a little bit. It's not the best quality, excuse the pixelation. On both the area that went, actually, no, this, there we go. That went north, which was along the lines of the waterway, and then south, it went down towards the bottom here. As I referenced the Grace Cathedral, that was where this point over here was located at. And so going into those areas, a structure like this can be used to harness energy. And so it can collect from everything within the triangle to create a point of access. And that's something that can be cultivated. Now, when you're pulling in, it's almost like, kind of like stealing Wi-Fi to a certain degree, plugging into somebody else's system. The thing about this is that it's not just the energy of the earth. Again, it can also be what is located above it. And so you can actually harness the energy, whether we're talking about something that's more kinetic, like footsteps or cars or even people. And so that energy can be harnessed, can be collected, and then can be concentrated and used to create in a very certain and specific way. And so one of the things that really came into fruition, here's another picture of a little bit more clear representation. In the dowsing, as I sat at that spot there, I could feel it. The energy was palpable. It was something that was very visceral. I could feel the energy as it really just centralized in this one single location. And so as I sat there, again, kind of contemplating all this, what does all this mean? And then happening to look up and see the Freemason Lodge, which again, doesn't necessarily mean that that relationship fully does exist, though it does bring up some interesting questions, especially when we start to see some of the correspondences of John W. Geary and the time, not just the timing of and acting as the first mayor, also going a little bit further in terms of the lapse of the fire of 1851, as well as his last day in office. Now, that is a remarkable coincidence, if it is one, and it begs more questions. Now, at the time, I wasn't really going to go too far in that line because my intention was not to make sense necessarily of the grid, as it was really to figure out how to release this spiritual energy that was stuck at the Majestic. And so having an idea that something like this existed was one part of it. It was something that helped to both verify the potential presence of a metaphysical barrier, and also really tied into the questions I was asking in terms of what was keeping them stuck, right? Because those three different entities, the woman who had committed suicide in 1908, there was then the Lady Lisa figure who returned to this place. The happiest she was in this place. And then the previous manager of the Hotel Majestic, which was more recent in the mid 2000 teens. Now, one of the things to look at then is not just the concept of how a barrier can act as a container, almost a prison of sorts, was also, though, because then that can prohibit to a certain degree transitions that may not be clean. And when I say clean, when in that moment of death, if we've to a certain degree reconciled things within inside of ourselves, we come to a certain place, we have fewer emotional tethers and anchors, which obviously as we transition, that's something that can definitely affect and influence that moment of passing. There can be other things that may come into play, and that's what this barrier effectively was. Now, it led to further questions, though, and that question really being, is this a chicken or an egg? Is the barrier what led to the passing of these three individuals in their own way? Was there something else that was happening? Are they actually related? Is the other thing that happened that may have influenced the energy of this place and the feel of this space? Is that something that could be amplified by this grid, by this barrier. And these are all things that really started to well up in terms of a line of questioning and a thread of inquiry. So, as all of this then really became much more clear, I really started to have more curiosity about it. So when I actually got then back to the Hotel Majestic that night, it was a matter of then doing what I could to sort of interview the strongest entity of the three, who was none too happy about my presence there, let alone the energy that I was bringing into the Majestic. And it wasn't anything that was necessarily on my part negative, though it was disruptive. And it's happened before, and I'm sure it, may happen again. The energy that I carry, the acknowledgement of an entity, the capacity to sense and detect energy. A lot of these things operate beyond, to a certain degree, a firewall. It's kind of funny as we're talking about this, a wall of fire. And effectively, they stay outside of the range and the realm of everyday perception. What we're talking about is really going into a deeper level of intuitive perception. Now, by and large, most of our day is spent utilizing our left hemisphere. Now, left hemisphere can also be identified as more of that masculine piece. It's what we identify as rational, logical. It's the part that really looks at systems, analytics, methodologies. The right-hand side being more of that more emotional piece, creativity, imagination, intuition. And so most of our day is structured in one way, shape, or form. And so we spend a lot of our waking hours in our left hemisphere. Now, the right-hand side is where we can actually access the deeper parts and pieces of our experiences. We can access things beyond everyday perception. And as we get into this more effectively an altered state of consciousness, then we can open our awareness to things that are beyond what we would typically see with our own eyes. And that is effectively what happened here. I mean, interestingly, with all the things that were happening, the demagnetization of my key card for the hotel, the elevator breaking, videos going offline, videos getting distorted. I mean, I ended up losing a camera as well as an digital audio recording device, and they just got fried. And so it's something that when we encounter these types of entities, there can be a very real experience and a very real effect. As we transition in death, it is the passage of our own energy into a different spectrum, if you will, a different kind of like a radio station. We may be tuned into a very specific frequency, and then when we transition, we are now at a different frequency that may not be as attainable or as accessible to the everyday person. So as all this really came through, more questions coming in terms of what led to the three entities being not just trapped, but also to a certain degree, what led them to being focused upon this area. And was there another contributing factor that may have also led to the suicides themselves? So join me in episode 4 as I endeavor to answer those questions and go a little bit deeper into the investigation as well. For now, though, love and aloha. Take care and ahui ho.